Welcome to Behind the Headlines. Today we're talking about Palo Alto's response to the Santa Clara County Civil Grand Jury report on affordable housing. The Civil Grand Jury released a report in June that essentially calls for all 15 cities in the county to take drastic action to close the housing gap. And last week, Palo Alto responded to the report by essentially resisting all of its recommendations. So, Gennady, tell us what's going on.
Well, to be clear, they didn't resist all of them, but they did take a lot of issues with some of the really main ones, including some of the responses that seem some of the recommendations and findings that seem to be kind of well established. Like the idea that not having housing near employer centers worsens traffic congestion. I feel like it's kind of accepted gospel throughout the region. And if you look at other cities' responses, nobody challenges that. I mean, I looked at a few recently, like Mountain View basically agrees, Los Altos agrees, but Palo Alto finds that to be not necessarily true because there's many other factors.
Let's go down. What were the recommendations, and then what were the responses to those?
Well, there's a couple of dozens of findings and recommendations, but some of the big ones include like planning for housing near mass transit stations, joining a sub-region with other cities to better coordinate their response to the housing crisis. Those are some of the big ones. Using density bonuses more aggressively for affordable housing. And in some cases, Palo Alto has already implemented some of the policies, like charging, for example, commercial developers to subsidize affordable housing. But what's striking is some of the findings, they seem almost kind of like not even directions to do something, just kind of stating something that's been accepted as a fact. Palo Alto kind of took a lot of issues, even with those. So for that reason, I think the report, the Palo Alto's response, which was approved last week, was instantly characterized by some of the housing advocates as anemic, incomplete, and basically amounts to Palo Alto shirking its duties to addressing the affordable housing crisis, which is obviously problematic because according to the grand jury, Palo Alto is among the worst cities in the last decade in addressing its RHNA housing allocations. So, yeah.
So what's it mean if they're resisting these recommendations? I mean, they don't have to do any of these recommendations.
Right. I mean, I think this, in some ways, more of like a tone issue than actual practicality issues, because the city is not required to actually address to implement the kind of policies the grand jury recommends. All the city is required to do is issue a response to each of these findings. So in some ways, it's not going to have too much of an impact on the ground, but I think it is significant in the fact that it still kind of underscores a lot of the attitudes among the city council, broadly in the community, which is generally skeptical about some of the proposals that are already kind of established elsewhere in the county.
This seems to me also to be, isn't this kind of a reality disconnect as well? Because I thought that the city was we'd always heard things about, well, if we're going to put in housing, we should do housing along El Camino, let's put housing near transit corridors. So it almost seems like now they're turning around and saying the opposite. That, not necessarily so. It's not necessarily important.
Yeah, I mean, that's really striking. I feel like even when you go to when you look at what the city's been approving recently, like the housing development in El Camino and Page Mill, and the types of zoning changes they're considering in the Ventura area and elsewhere with affordable housing overlay, a lot of it is predicated on the availability of transportation options. So it's kind of striking seeing Palo Alto being I don't want to say alone, but definitely in a minority in suggesting, and they call it partially disagree with this finding. That
But you said that
hedging their bets.
What was Mountain View's response or other cities' responses?
Well, I didn't look at all of them. I've looked at Mountain View's and Los Altos, and you can tell a lot about where the city council stands just by reading these responses. And you can gauge a lot about the politics in each city. But Los Altos was very brief. They basically say, we agree with a bunch of findings in a row. Mountain View, which has been a little more enthusiastic about actually building housing unprompted by grand jury, they very much agree, and they actually have a couple of paragraphs explaining why they agree and why it's so important to kind of build housing near job sites and build housing near mass transit areas. And there's also kind of, Palo Alto has other issues with the report that including the characterizations of the NIMBY versus YIMBY arguments, which Palo Alto doesn't see as big an issue as the grand jury did, whereas others seem to concur with the general findings.
Didn't the grand jury report also talk about sort of having more regional or collaborations between different cities so that they could kind of achieve the goals, working together and kind of understand what each other's goals were? And so Palo Alto, by kind of standing alone, aren't they sort of isolating themselves in terms of just basically saying we're not going to be good neighbors, let everybody else do the building? I mean, I just was in East Palo Alto at their city council meeting, and it's like a complete reversal of Palo Alto's perspective.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, for them, it's let's figure out all the ways we can to build as much affordable housing and a mix of housing as we possibly can. And housing for low, include what they call inclusionary housing.
Right. Well, I will say that if you ask the city council, they will say that housing is their top priority. It's been officially adopted as a priority and they set a goal of building 300 units a year, like a tangible goal, which they're nowhere close to meeting.
I think you said something like 157
Yeah,
apartment.
the one El Camino Pageville they approved. And last year they approved like some rental housing for the Mike's Bike sign.
Yeah.
They're pursuing something else like that El Camino Palo Alto housing, which is another about 60 units. And that would be affordable housing, below market rate. But that hasn't been approved yet. That's still has to be reviewed by the Planning Commission and the council. So this year the only thing that got approved was that Windy Hill project for workforce housing, which would also kind of be off limits to people who are low income and the kind of people that the grand jury focuses on. But I should point out that you mentioned the recommendation that cities should form a region. That's actually something that the council was very supportive of, but you wouldn't know that from reading the city's official response.
Right.
Like when the grand jury recommendation is that RHNA, which is an acronym, is Regional Housing Needs Allocation, basically the allotment that each city gets as its target for zoning. Basically, the grand jury recommended that such a subregion should be formed, including one or more low-cost cities and one or more high-cost cities by the end of 2021. And the city's response basically is, this will not be implemented, it's not reasonable. Palo Alto cannot accept the recommendation on another jurisdiction's behalf, which is fair, because it depends on others. But then after that it says, moreover, BMR housing should not be directed to low-cost cities as implied with this recommendation. Housing affordability are acute problems in high-cost cities, and city supports equitable distributions throughout the region. So what the city's response is saying, we should not have deals between high-cost cities like Palo Alto and maybe more low-cost communities like Gilroy or wherever else property values are lower, because we don't think it should be just the low-cost cities that should be providing housing. Everybody should be providing housing. That's what the response says.
That's what Palo Alto is saying.
That's what Palo Alto response says. And this is why we're not too gung-ho about going with this. But if you ask any housing advocate, they're like, that's a good thing to say, but you're not building any housing. So it's like you're saying everybody should do it, but you're not doing it. So by default, it falls at the low cost.
And doesn't it put the spotlight on them too if you have these so-called collaborations and they don't do anything, so they just make somebody else do it?
Yeah, absolutely. But I should also point out that the city council, in its discussion of this report, even they approved this response by 8-1 vote. Adrian Fine was the only person who dissented because he thought the response was very weak and basically didn't own up to the problem. But even though they accepted this report, in their comments on it, I think almost everybody said that they think that this kind of RHNA subregion would be a good idea. It's already used in other parts of the state, including like Napa County and San Mateo County. And so there's been actually a movement in Santa Clara County by the Cities Association to get this thing going. Greg Sharp is part of the committee that's been exploring it. And so I think this is actually one recommendation where the city's response says, we're not that interested, but the city council says we actually are interested. So it'll be kind of neat to see
If a
the next few months
subregion
they
is
do it.
implemented, how does it work and what would Palo Alto's role be?
Okay. Well, say Palo Alto joins forces with another city in the county. Well, I use Gilroy as an example, even though it's not very near Palo Alto, but any city that has like lower property values. And what would happen is under the current system, ABAG and MTC basically tell each city, this is how many housing units you have to zone for. If they work together, they can make a deal that maybe Gilroy provides more housing, takes some of Palo Alto's share because property values are lower, and they have a better shot of building them. And in exchange, Palo Alto could help pay for transportation, infrastructure, all sorts of other things to make this housing kind of, to support, hypothetically, Gilroy's construction. And so that's kind of how it works.
Like in lieu fees. It's like paying an in lieu fee.
Exactly. And the end result would be basically you would get the housing units in areas where they're more likely to be built anyway because of high property costs. Now, there's some resistance to this idea because some people say, and including the response here suggests, yes, property costs are a big factor in developers deciding whether to build housing, especially below market rate housing, but it's not the only factor. So if you focus on that exclusively, it may not achieve the kind of things that you think it will achieve. Because those other factors include politics, government policies, neighborhood, feelings about developments, traffic impacts, school impacts. There's a wide variety of factors that might make certain developers kind of hesitant to build in certain cities. But I think it's kind of hard to argue with the fact that astronomical land costs would be a huge factor. And I think that's the main focus of this grand jury recommendation.
Well, the other thing, too, that's interesting is that I don't think it takes into account the fact that if you were to put more housing, let's say you had this big trade-off and people were building more housing, you had developers building more housing in a place like Gilroy, now you've got to consider that people are going to have to travel, right? So
right.
How does that work out? Now you've created the whole traffic mess. And the lack of infrastructure for mass transit.
Right, which is why I think as part of this sub-region concept, Palo Alto would be paying for this traffic to mitigate this traffic mess. Maybe they could run shuttles. Again, it would make more sense if it wasn't Gilroy, but someplace closer. Maybe I didn't use the best example.
Where is there a place closer that would be, more affordable?
I pretty much think any place is closer more affordable than Palo Alto, but yeah, Palo Alto would be responsible for helping to pay to offset some of these impacts in this model that is pursued. Well, we'll see how it goes. We could track this for a few months and see if the city associations does anything, but that is one thing Palo Alto is on board with.
So what is Palo Alto actually doing?
Yeah, good question. They actually have quite a few things in the works, but it remains to be seen whether it achieves actual housing. One thing that the council is about to take up is accessory dwelling units, they've changed the rules a year ago, and they've seen actually increased production of ADUs. And so there's been some problems associated with confusion over some regulations, questions about basements and ADUs, these kind of details that the council is going to refine soon. But that's actually one area where they've seen some success. They're doing more to protect renters, not as much as many people hope, but they did just this past week change their rental relocation assistance. So if a tenant is evicted, they will now get between $7,000 and $17,000 from the landlord, regardless of their income. The prior law, which they approved in August 27th, had an income restriction. So they removed that. That's a tenant protection thing. And they're also looking at new zoning revisions, some to accommodate specific projects, like the one we mentioned on El Camino and Page Mill, and the one we mentioned on El Camino near Wilton Court, which is the Palo Alto housing. So come up with new zoning designations that would allow more density, which is kind of, in many ways, in keeping with grand jury recommendation, though Palo Alto wouldn't admit that. They seem to be kind of defiant of the grand jury, but they are kind of doing that. And in addition, I think the Planning Commission will be discussing next Wednesday a whole host of revisions to the zoning ordinance. And if these kick in, and if the council ultimately approves them, that would be kind of a big deal, because they would actually be changing things like parking requirements, allowed density. Instead of RM15, which is the zoning where you could build 15 units per acre, they would consider raising that to RM20, allow 20 units per acre. So they're picking away at the zoning code with the hopes of adopting a new zoning ordinance later this year, or a zoning amendment, which could be kind of a bigger deal. Again, they're still not getting close to the 300 unit mark that's set in their comprehensive plan and that they establish as their official goal. But along the margins, they are making these kinds of incremental kind of steps, and so some progress.
Some progress. What was, when they issued their letter about the report, what was the public response? Did you get any feeling of public reaction?
Yeah, I mean, the people who spoke, keep in mind, this was a very late meeting and very late discussion. So the people who stayed for this part of the discussion were the true warriors. And so and they were pretty disappointed. I mean, I think most of the people who spoke were hoping to get more from the council. They were hoping to see a stronger response instead of partially disagree, and all these recommendations. I think one person who spoke actually, I repeated his point a little while ago. He's basically, Palo Alto is saying that, housing should be spread equally. That's why you're resisting to RENA, but you're not building any. So it's kind of ironic.
Do you think the stronger response was, did people say the stronger response was that they wanted them to come out more for housing or less for housing?
More for housing. Yeah, from the people who spoke. But again, the kind of people who speak in this grand jury report are the ones who really care about the policy. But when an individual project comes up and you actually see the tangible details and the traffic impacts, all that, you usually get a much more mixed response because reality hits home. So yeah, I think, and even a few members of the council who supported this. I mean, Corey Wolbach voted for this response, but he also said that he's not thrilled about it. He thinks it's really weak. So yeah, the response wasn't overwhelmingly positive. But I think the council majority felt that because the city doesn't really have to follow these, just respond to the report. They don't want to spend too much time quibbling with the points. They said the staff drafted letter is good enough, kind of good enough for us, so they signed off on it. But
All right. Is there anything else?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Well, that wraps up today's Behind the Headlines. Thanks for watching. If you liked what you heard, press the button below. If you want to stay up to date on Palo Alto news, go to paloaltoonline.com or follow us on social media. Thanks.